So right now I want to just take a few minutes and give some context to the kind of studying and thinking that we're going to be doing during this class. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of the main ones is to help us learn to, I guess you could say, both critically engage and also use our polity as a tool for our present environment. So it doesn't become just a list of things that we've some kind of how to learn how to navigate to get things done, but become something that's helping us meet both the challenges and the opportunities that we encounter in these days. So that's one reason to do this. Another reason is that it will situate some of the readings that we're going to be doing, particularly the Hotchkiss book, which expands our study of governance and polity beyond just what Presbyterians do to what other church leaders are doing, and also helps situate Stefan Pass's book on mission, what he calls missional spirituality, which is, I think, even trying to get at this from an even broader category. What and how are we shaped to participate in God's mission for today? Plus, it gives me an opportunity to introduce to you some of the other readings that won't be required, but that I'll put in some weeks. Our denomination has produced a number of study papers and guides and thought pieces through the years as we've worked to be a church together, and I want to give you an opportunity to see those and in some sense get a window into the ongoing work of our denomination and thinking about our ecclesial future. Finally, really, this is part of the work of our polity, encapsulated in the Form of Government, Chapter 2, which says that we are a church that is Ecclesia Reformata, Semper Reformanda, Secundum Verbum Dei. That is the church reformed and always reforming according to the Word of God. And then our Book of Order actually adds the phrase, and the call of the Spirit. And we want to be a part of that work. So this will help us kind of move in those kinds of directions as a class. In order to do that, let me start actually not with one of our readings, but start with Al Roxborough in his book, Missional Mapmaking, makes 3 notes about some broad cultural transformations. And he notes first that our society is moving from what he calls an industrial society to a networking society. So you can see this economically as industrial plants get more dispersed around the globe. Part of this is related to globalization. And also as the importance of being interconnected with one another has really gotten higher. So he says we're less industrial and more of a networking. And then he says this, that much of our polity, and actually he notes Robert's Rules, our parliamentary guide, is from an industrial age. So in some ways, we are learning to use tools that were developed and shaped in an age in which we are not natively living. So we can certainly see that when people try to have virtual meetings or when groups want to text to one another and make decisions together, and that those modes of communication are alien to the ways that we have put together the ways that we will work together and think together. So networking age, still have Robert's Rules. He also talks about the church having shifted its position and moved into what he calls marginality from, says the church had public prominence, now we're in a privatized location. That really the height of particularly mainline Christianity was after World War II, when churches were full and people wanted to be members of a church because there was some social stand to that, particularly mainline churches. He talks about the breaking down of Christendom, which are the social ways that the church has been supported, particularly in the Western world. So that's going. And this is, we move from a moral and social imaginary that involves the church at the center to the church, not even at the margins, but kind of a decentered thing. And what he calls Constantinianism, which are the formal structures that have often supported the church, things like blue laws that had churches, that had businesses closed on Sundays so churches could be open. It's a formal relationship between church and state. And he says, we've even moved not even from the center to the sidelines, but to kind of a floating, that there's no more decentering because our societies lack centers. And we have a polity that really is built on an imaginary where there is space and time for people to be deeply engaged in ways that people often struggle to do these days. He also notes shifts, that means, in expectations for pastors. In modernity, pastors were teachers and professionals, so we were expected to be able to moderate meetings, we were expected to be able to teach and preach. Now that has exploded in terms of expectations, and pastors are called CEOs, coaches, counselors, and it goes on from there. So that shifts how we relate to our polity, particularly if our polity is designed with a particular understanding of what a pastor is going to be in mind. This brings us actually to Paas, who notes at the beginning of his book that mission is born from the desire of the gospel to have an influence on human lives and societies. And then he says at the beginning that he's been impressed by how profoundly our thinking about mission and evangelism is flavored by the connection between Christian faith and cultural power. So let me just pause there and say that I think that our Book of Order represents that. So, some of our confessions were written by people who were supported by princes like the Heidelberg Catechism, or the Lords of Scotland like the Scots Confession, that was forged in the midst of a political battle, and the church was right in the middle of that. And we are used to a Christian faith that actually has a fair amount of cultural power. And as that shifts, really our understandings of what it's going to take in terms of the ways that we are together, our ecclesial relationships, I believe need to shift. So we need to learn our Book of Order, but also the context in which it was developed. And then he says we have a great deal to learn from biblical narratives of exile and diaspora. So this scattering where the people of God have found themselves without the kind of overt influence in a culture that they often have been used to. Maybe there's some things to learn there about how we shape ourselves in our lives. And of course, in terms of what we need pastors to do, what we think worship's going to look like, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, all deeply shaped by how we understand how we relate to the culture that we're in. Are we part of the dominant culture? Are we not part of the dominant culture? What does it mean to be with other people on the margins? If people are working on Sunday mornings, so we find other places to worship when our deep cultural expectation is that it's been on Sunday mornings. It's all of those kinds of questions that we start to have about who we are and how we do mission together. This brings us to polity, and here I want to talk about Hotchkiss in particular. He says that polity is the advice of the founders about who best discerns direction and manages the mission. And I just want to say, you've heard me talk about what I think the definition of polity is. Hotch's definition is not the same. His has more to do with what the past is going to bring into the present. And I agree with him. It certainly represents what we have in the past. I think that I want a more creative and a more theological definition. And of course, he's working from a kind of a different vantage point. He goes on to note that there are two problems with denominational advice. One, as he says, it is best in a certain size. If you've got churches that have between 150 to 400 in attendance, then what he says is denominational advice, denominational polities tend to work fairly well. Smaller than that, he says it doesn't work, because what's going on is that those kind of social understandings of the way things are done in very small congregations don't jive with the formal structures of a parliamentary procedure or a polity that expects that there's going to be committees and expects that there's going to be formal votes. He also says you get to large churches and the polity can be constraining. It's not nearly nimble enough to help larger congregations navigate what they need to do. And those of you who have been part of multi-service congregations that then try to have congregational meetings know that this can often be a touch point of smaller congregations. If there is a matriarch or a patriarch of a congregation and they really make the decisions about what happens, or a single family that is the bulk of the funding, again, that doesn't jive very well with the kind of polity that we have. The other thing he says about polities is that they're problem-centered, and that if you look for problems, you find them. And it is true. There's actually a book written about our Book of Order called Blood on Every Page, which says that many of the things that are in our Book of Order came out of conflicts that people had. Well, that causes an imaginary where people are then looking for conflicts in order to decide what to do. He also says that American congregations are influenced by American democratic culture, that no matter the polity, there is a strong tendency towards a de facto congregationalism. Well, for those of us who call ourselves Presbyterian, that locate power in other structures besides a congregation or even a session, even a congregational board, that is a strong cultural push for us and something about which we need to be aware. We can, and I do hear this, the creeping congregational people get upset about it. Hotchkiss has a different perspective on it. And he says, we're talking about just the cultural environment in which we live and how we live in that environment. And it's not so much something that is to be resisted or something that is to be derided. It's a factor of the culture that we need to take into account as we shape our life together. And finally, he talks about this disestablished culture, including the impact of work on time and expectations, the reality that for many of our people, there is not the same kind of time that our forebears had to give to congregational matters. There's a shopping ethos, and again, we can deride that, we can resist that, we can look down on it. And yet the reality remains that for many of our people, they bring a set of expectations shaped by consumerist culture when it comes to the church. And I think Hotchkiss is helpful in terms of identifying that calmly and then saying, how are we going to live in that? Not how are we going to just talk about it negatively because it creates more work for us. And he also talks about a different attitude towards clergy there that's very important as we think about a polity's attitude towards pastoral power and position, and then cultural attitudes toward pastoral power and position. He also talks, and I find this really helpful, about how complicated it is for pastors to work in environments where there are multiple expectations on the clergy. So clergy are both a preacher but also a pastor. We do baptisms, and then we also are head of staff. And the people on our boards are board members and decision makers. They're also the funders. It's not that way in most other nonprofit entities, and that creates a lot of challenges for the church. So in the midst of our cultural environment, these are the things that are pressing on the polity. He notes that congregations are different than after World War II. The world is different from the world in which Robert's Rules was designed, and congregations are different from other organizations, particularly because people occupy multiple roles in the life of the organization, and the leader occupies multiple roles in the people's lives. So I was just speaking about that. But those are the kinds of things that are lifted up that help us to understand that as we're learning this environment, it was written in and in many ways comes out of a very different culture than we find ourselves in now. And we've got both to learn it so that we can use it, but also to start to think about what do we want theologically from how we understand who God is, what do we want missionally in terms of what our future looks like. I really believe that you all are going to be part of a major reshaping of ecclesial life, and there's grand opportunities here that I look forward to seeing what you all do with it and to be a part of it. The implications for that, if you've had other classes with me, you know that Ronald Heifetz with his adaptive leadership is important to me. These are some things from Todd Bolsinger's books, Canoeing the Mountains, which some of you have read with me. The implications here is this is called adaptive work. It means that we need to do the kind of leadership that creates structures and hold people together through conflictive and sometimes painful processes that addresses questions for which there are not easy answers. He goes on to note that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I mean, and that's one of the reasons I think the first several chapters of the Book of Order, particularly the Form of Government and the Book of Confessions, are the most important things that we have. They're the ones that create our culture. They're the ones that I really long for you to learn, understand, live into, and help us develop for the future. We need healthy organizational culture in order to thrive in uncharted places. And the other thing he says, we need to reclaim our core story. Well, our confessions are our core story as a denomination. Our Book of Order is our core story about how we want to be together. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this chart. I'd encourage you to maybe pause this here and just look at the way that Heifetz talks about different types of situations, different types of problems, how they're solved. And what what I would say is the cultural environment in which we live creates polity possibilities. It's not just problems, it's possibilities where we need to learn, to even understand it. We need to learn for solutions, and that's the leader and the people together. It is not the case where just learning the Book of Order is going to help people go out and clergy go out and implement things. We've got to learn how to learn and help our people learn so that together we can figure out the future and follow God into it. Paas talks about ways the church has responded to these kinds of cultural shifts. One of the things that I find really helpful about Paas is his work on what he calls Volkschurch or Volkskirche or Volkskirche in Dutch. And he talks about concepts of church that are embedded in Europe, where there's massive, albeit nominal, church membership. There can be a formal relationship between the church and state. And then what happens is the church gives attention to political and societal structures, and there's an emphasis on the institutional unity of the church. I would say it was really helpful to me to read about that and think about the development of the American church from that context. We don't think of ourselves as being a Volkskirche, but I think there are many ways that the mainline churches, apart from the formal relationship between church and state, really understand ourselves to function in this way. So we've been comfortable with massive, albeit nominal, church membership. We do tend to think about the relationship between church and state a lot, and we give a lot of attention to political and societal structures and the institutional unity of the church. And what he says is we've got to learn how to be minority churches, which involves a different conception about how to be together and to work together. He goes on to say that Christians need to learn to have their spirituality independent of success in terms of church growth or worldly improvement. We need a spirituality, and I would say here a polity. I mean, Paas's spirituality is an incarnational spirituality. It is not an abstract spirituality or a Gnostic spirituality. And my understanding of polity is that it is an embedded incarnational spirituality. It can handle failure and obstruction, and the identity of churches and Christians is not identified with what they're doing in the world. Massive shifts for the way that many of us understand who we are and what we're to be about. To know that, just a little bit of history that I think is helpful. We start in Geneva. Much of our kind of story starts in Geneva with John Calvin. He had 4 types of church officers: ministers of the word, doctors, elders, and deacons. And you see that some of that language comes through into our present age. Minister of the word preached, administered the sacrament, exercised pastoral discipline. The elders were 12 laymen, and they were all men whose task was to serve. They were a moral police force, and there were deacons who oversaw institutional charity. And you can see the threads of that continuing, where our ministers of word and sacrament, our teaching elders preach, administer the sacrament, exercise pastoral care. We don't talk as much about discipline. We want elders to serve as leaders for the church. Again, moral police force would not be a language that we would use, and deacons often doing with care of people and community. There were 3 religious institutions in Geneva. There was the consistory that was primarily charged with institution or with discipline. And I think there's a thread here for us to follow, that many of our polity bases were built around the idea that we were going to exercise high church discipline, and we've shifted expectations for those offices, but in some ways not the functioning. The company of pastors were pastors that gathered, and they were responsible for pastoral placements in the area of Geneva. And then there's this congregation, is how it's said. It was an adult Bible study that happened every Friday, and it was the holding environment for all the decision-making that went on in Geneva. It's not actually talked about very much, but I think really important in terms of imagining what the future could look like as we hold together the need to do tasks, the need to do relationship, the focus on God, and how does all of that come together. We go on to Scotland, and in 1560, John Knox, who had studied with John Calvin, takes Calvin's theology back to Scotland and is part of a group that reorganizes the church along Calvinist lines. There were a number of splits. They write a confession called the Confession of 1560, which is in our Book of Confessions. What they call the church is the Kirk, and that language continues in terms of our own usage sometimes. Congregations became free to choose their own pastor, so you can see that development in terms of our own polity. They could not fire the person. Congregations increasingly need to be financially self-supporting. No more bishops. They had something called a superintendent. They were trying to figure out kind of those mid-levels, and they had much of an emphasis on democratic decision-making. And you can see those kinds of threads kind of like coming into the kind of polity that we have developed here in America. Along the way, there was in England a Westminster Assembly, 1643 to 1649, so it's about 100 years after Knox. They produced a confession of faith, but never a church polity. One was proposed, but could not be agreed upon. And so you can start to see, even in that level of our history, this split between being able to agree on kind of some abstract theology, but when it comes to how we're going to do things, it can become very contentious for us. That history comes to America, and then the congregations that start in America start to come together and figure out how they're going to be together. And they had some early synods. Eventually, an important early part of our history is the Adopting Act of 1729. It was an act of the Synod of Philadelphia, which was an early Presbyterian body. Presbyterians came into New Jersey and New York, but centered around Philadelphia, colonial America. And there they decided that they would require ministers to agree with the necessary and essential articles of the Westminster Standards. So that's the Westminster Confession of Faith. It was a compromise between some who wanted a strict subscriptionism and others who wanted less hierarchy and believed more in individual conscience. And so we came with this idea of declaring scruples. So people said, I will agree to all that's necessary and essential, and I will scruple things with which I disagree, and a presbytery would decide if that was okay or not okay. The directory of worship and form of government was simply declared to be agreeable in substance to the Word of God and earnestly recommended. See, so it wasn't all that agreed upon, and so you can see this has been a history of development for us as a denomination. 1758 was the very first proposal of form of government. It was rejected. There's no copy of that. 1788, we adopted our first form of government. We've been revising it ever since. And so that there's a process by which we do that, and our polity has been under revision from the very beginning. And you can see some threads that come through in terms of how that is shaped, and some things that continue to be part of our conversations. What's it like today? And here I want to introduce you to two resources that are on the website. The paper Historical Principles, Conscience and Church Government, which was adopted in 1983, right as the Northern and Southern churches came together. And there they said that the polity of Presbyterianism, with its insistence on the rule of the majority and the rights of the minority, is indeed the way in which Presbyterians affirm our unity and diversity. So all this conversation about unity and diversity, this polity not only organizes dissent and diversity, it's the product of dissent, and they do go on to say that all this emphasis on human decision-making can lead to an erroneous conviction that if we're only faithful enough or smart enough or try hard enough, we could solve the church's problems. So as you face congregational problems, denominational problems these days, 1983, they wrote a paragraph that I think could be written today. 10 years later, this is actually the same document. There's a sense in which the historical principles of the Presbyterian Church and the Adopting Act of 1729 brought up to date and applied to polity as well as doctrine. And those historic principles are now in our Book of Order, and we will read them and we will talk about them. 10 years after that report, there was another report, the Special Committee on the Nature of the Church and the Practice of Governance. So we've been talking about how this polity stuff is going to work. And after 10 years as a reunited church, they were acknowledging fragmentation and uncertainty. We are preoccupied with the leadership crisis from congregational life to General Assembly leadership expectations. We struggle with the paradox of an increase of giving, decreased amount of money going through the governing body system, and declining membership. So these kinds of conversations about our polity, they continue to be a part part of what we are doing. Implications for all of this cultural stuff, our own history. I think there's some solidity that we've got. There's some gifts we've got from the past that can bring continuity to us. We're in a time of enormous change with a deep need to adapt to our present environment. And I believe that you're going to be the generation that helps us do that in terms of both deeply understanding our polity, holding on to what is the best of our history, and then devising creative ways that we can move into the future. And I look forward to seeing you do that.